This is the history that refuses to stay buried. A flash of light brighter than 100 suns erupts over Halifax Harbour. A split second later comes the sound. A thunderclap so deep and violent it seems to tear the sky in two. Windows shatter into jagged missiles. Walls crumple like paper. In an instant, a quiet December morning is transformed into hell on earth. People are knocked off their feet blocks away, ears ringing with an eerie silence after the colossal boom. At the harbor's edge, a man standing in awe one moment is thrown like a rag doll the next. A mother shields her little boy as their kitchen window explodes inward, spraying glass shards across the room. Streetcars a mile away rock and derail. The ground itself trembles as if the earth has cried out in pain. Then, as the roar finally fades, a deadly hush falls, a lull before the screams and sirens begin. This was Halifax, 1917, a city obliterated in the blink of an eye. They would call it the largest man-made explosion the world had ever seen, a blast so powerful it was felt hundreds of miles away. In the immediate aftermath, stunned survivors stumble through streets that no longer exist, past smoking craters and collapsed houses, searching desperately for loved ones. They have no idea what just happened, only that their world has exploded around them, and nothing will ever be the same. If you want to help me translate more stories like this, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Only minutes ago, those same Halifax streets had been bustling with life. Dock workers laughed and sipped hot coffee in the crisp winter air down by the piers. Shopkeepers swept their stoops and unlocked doors. Children trotted off to school, mittens on, and school books clutched tight. It was a typical bright morning in a booming port city at war, until fate intervened with a horrible twist. Halifax in 1917 was a city alive with purpose. World War I raged across the ocean, and this Canadian harbor had become one of the busiest in the world. Each day, convoys of merchant ships gathered in the vast Bedford Basin, preparing to cross the Atlantic with troops, munitions, and supplies for the Allies. Soldiers in khaki uniforms mingled with sailors on leave along the steep, hilly streets. Factories chugged and clanged, and the smell of coal smoke mixed with salty sea air. Halifax thrived on the business of war, its harbor choked with vessels from every corner of the globe. But on this December morning, amid the routine bustle, two ships were about to cross paths and seal the city's doom. In the Narrows, the tight strait linking the harbor to the basin, a French cargo ship named Mont-Blanc made her way toward Halifax docks. She had arrived from New York overnight, delayed by fog, and now glided slowly into the harbor with the morning traffic. Outwardly, nothing set Mont-Blanc apart from any other freighter, but deep in her holds and strapped on her decks was a secret cargo that made her a floating bomb. Nearly 3,000 tons of high explosives packed her from bow to stern, stacks of TNT and picric acid, volatile gun cotton, and barrels of benzol fuel. By strict orders of wartime secrecy, Mont-Blanc flew no red flag to warn of her contents. No one in Halifax knew the danger quietly steaming into their midst. At the same time, the SS Emo, a Norwegian vessel chartered to carry relief supplies, was preparing to leave Halifax. The Emo had spent 2 days in port taking on coal and provisions. Now, on the morning of December 6th, she was finally heading out of Bedford Basin, and she was moving faster than she should. Her captain, a gruff Norwegian named Håkon From, was impatient to be underway. Cutting a line through the calm water, the Emo steered far to the left of the channel's center as she negotiated around incoming ships. This put her on a collision course. From Mont Blanc's bridge, Captain Aimé Lemedec saw the Emo bearing down on the wrong side of the Narrows and felt a surge of alarm. He ordered a single long blast of his ship's whistle, asserting his right of way. The Emo responded with 2 blasts of its own, meaning, "No, you move." Mont-Blanc's pilot and captain exchanged a quick, anxious glance. They sounded another loud blast. Again, Emo answered with 2. The icy morning air filled with the shrill calls of dueling whistles. But it was too late. On the Halifax waterfront, a few workers paused, tools in hand, as they noticed 2 ships in the Narrows drawing dangerously close. A sailor on Mont-Blanc's bow waved frantically, and Emo's crew shouted and scrambled. Both ships had cut engines by now, white foam churning up as they reverse thrust, desperate to slow down. For one hopeful moment, it looked like they might drift past each other with mere feet to spare. But momentum and fate were not on their side. At 8:45 a.m., Emo's sharp bow punched into Mont-Blanc's forward hull with a grinding crunch of steel. The collision was slow, almost gentle by modern standards, but it was catastrophic in consequence. Mont-Blanc's hull screeched and groaned. Inside her hold, barrels toppled like dominoes. On deck, a few dozen drums of benzol, a highly flammable liquid, broke loose. Metal lids popped, and clear benzol began sloshing across the deck and down into the ruptured cargo hold, where bags of picric acid lay. As Emo's engines pulled her away, sparks flew from the grinding metal. In a heartbeat, Mont-Blanc's leaking benzol ignited. A tongue of flame shot up the side of the ship, and within seconds, a billowing cloud of thick black smoke was rising into the sky. The nightmare had begun. Mont-Blanc was ablaze from bow to stern, a floating time bomb that could blow at any moment. Captain Lemedec didn't even have time to radio a warning. "Sauve qui peut," he shouted to his crew. "Save yourselves," ordering them to abandon ship. They knew what would happen next. In panic, the sailors lowered the lifeboats and paddled frantically for the Dartmouth shore, yelling at anyone they saw on the water or docks to run. Meanwhile, the unmanned Mont-Blanc, now a ghost ship engulfed in flames, drifted slowly toward the Halifax side of the harbor and came to rest against Pier 6. All across Halifax, eyes turned toward the harbor and the rising column of smoke. It was a spectacular sight. The fire on the Mont-Blanc sent up crackling, multicolored flames as various chemicals burned. Orange, blue, violet. For most onlookers, it was curiosity and amazement at a scene unlike anything they'd ever witnessed. Crowds began to gather on the slopes of Citadel Hill, on downtown rooftops, and all along the waterfront to watch. In kitchens and living rooms, people pressed their faces to windows for a better view of the spectacle. In the Navy dockyard, a few officers watched with apprehension. Something about the intensity of the blaze troubled them, though they couldn't imagine the true cause. On the streets of the Richmond district, families stepping outside to head to work stopped in their tracks to gaze at the fiery ship. Children on their way to school paused to marvel at the distant inferno. Halifax had seen ship fires before. This was a major port in wartime, but nothing quite like this. Down at the Richmond rail yard by the harbor's edge, railway dispatcher Vincent Coleman had just sat down at his telegraph for the morning shift. He heard the crash of the collision, and soon after noticed the ominous plume of smoke. A sailor from the Navy Yard suddenly burst into the telegraph office, breathless and yelling a warning. The Mont-Blanc was packed with munitions and about to explode. Coleman's heart lurched. He and the other men in the station turned to flee. But then Coleman remembered the passenger train due to arrive in Halifax within minutes. The daily overnight express from St. John, loaded with some 300 unsuspecting people, was heading straight for the waterfront rail yards. If nothing was done, they would steam right into the apocalypse. Coleman glanced at his colleague, then back at his telegraph key. He knew he had only seconds. While his boss shouted for him to run, Vincent Coleman made a fateful choice. He sat back down and began hammering out a message on the telegraph as fast as his shaking fingers allowed. Hold up the train. Ammunition ship on fire in harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. His message warned along the wire to all stations up the line. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. The rhythmic clack of the key spoke his farewell for him. Having given the warning, Coleman stood from his desk. Perhaps he thought of his wife and young daughter at home one last time. And in the next moment, a blast of unimaginable force engulfed everything around him. At that exact moment, all over Halifax, time seemed to freeze. On the Mont Blanc, amid the roar of the flames, there came a blinding white flash. The ship's hull, packed with explosives, finally succumbed to the heat. At 9:04:35 a.m., the Mont Blanc exploded. The blast was beyond anything anyone had experienced, a scorching, thundering eruption that tore the sky. One instant the ship was there. The next it was simply gone, transformed into a fireball that climbed into the atmosphere. A ball of white-hot fire rose a mile high, sucking up seawater and debris and turning the harbor bed to dry land for a moment. The shockwave rippled out at the speed of sound. On shore, the fire crew who had been bravely spraying the burning ship vanished where they stood. 1 second they were aiming their hoses. The next second nothing remained of them or their engine but scattered fragments. The entire Richmond district, houses, factories, docks, was instantaneously obliterated. Mont Blanc's massive anchor, weighing over half a ton, flew into the sky like a toy and landed more than 2 miles away on the far side of the city. Chunks of iron, steel, and cargo blasted in every direction, many glowing red-hot as they scythed through the air. Across the harbor, the Immo was hurled into the shallows of Dartmouth, her hull slamming aground by the force of the blast and the great wave that followed, for the explosion had split the sea itself. The force gouged a hole in the harbor floor, and a towering tsunami rose up from the water. This wall of seawater, mixed with wreckage and flaming debris, raced onto the shore. It crashed over the Richmond docks and slammed into the city's waterfront, sweeping people, horses, rail cars, and entire buildings into the frothing water. On the far side of the harbor, the Mi'kmaq settlement at Tufts Cove, a small indigenous village that had stood there for generations, was engulfed by the wave and washed away in an instant. After the thunderous roar of the explosion, an eerie silence hung over Halifax. A vast cloud of smoke, ash, and dust now towered where the Mont Blanc had been, rising like a grim mushroom over the shattered city. For a heartbeat or two, no one could process what had occurred. Then debris began to rain down from the sky. Fragments of iron and ship timber, shards of glass, and pieces of lives obliterated pattered onto rooftops and streets. In a city that had been buzzing with life minutes before, an apocalyptic scene unfolded. Near the waterfront, what had moments ago been neighborhoods of wooden houses were now smoldering flatlands. Not a single structure remained identifiable in the blast zone. Dead and injured people lay everywhere. A ship's heavy cannon, blown high into the air from Mont Blanc's deck, came crashing down in a city park. In one neighborhood, a housewife who had been standing at her window now lay in the street without a scratch on her, killed by the sheer force of the air pressure bursting her lungs. In a schoolyard, children who had paused on their way to class lay motionless amid splinters of their schoolhouse, which had vanished into thin air. Across the harbor in Dartmouth, a young girl in a white dress who had been watching the fire from her porch now lay unconscious in her yard, thrown there by the blast, her dress torn and stained with ash. The human toll of the explosion was immediate and devastating. For those who survived the initial blast, chaos and horror surrounded them. One Halifax firefighter, Billy Wells, had been standing directly across from the Mont Blanc when it blew up. He was thrown clear over a building by the explosion's force and somehow survived. When he came to, he found that the blast had stripped the clothes right off his body and even torn the flesh from his arm. Dazed and half naked, Wells staggered through what remained of the waterfront. In every direction he looked, there were scenes from a nightmare. He later recalled seeing people hanging out of shattered windows, dead where they fell. Some had been decapitated by flying metal or glass. He saw others impaled on broken timbers, and some thrown onto overhead telegraph wires. Fires were breaking out everywhere from stoves and lamps that had toppled. Entire city blocks were in flames, adding thick black smoke to the already darkened sky. Downtown, farther from the blast, people had been blown off their feet and cut by flying glass. But many were still alive. They picked themselves up off the ground in confusion. Every pane of glass in the city had shattered at once. Shop fronts were reduced to empty frames. Clerks and customers staggered out of ruined stores on Barrington Street, bleeding from wounds. A streetcar lay on its side in the middle of the road, torn from the tracks. The handsome stone facades of banks and offices were pockmarked with holes and loose bricks. In the harbor, a schooner that had been sailing by when the explosion hit simply disappeared, vaporized along with its crew. Other ships near the blast were burning or sinking, and sailors clung to pieces of floating wreckage in the suddenly churning harbor waters. The wave that had washed over the shore dragged wreckage and people back into the sea as it receded, then pushed them ashore again in a tangle of splintered wood, cargo, and drowned bodies. It was as if Halifax had been struck by a cruel combination of earthquake, fire, and bombardment all at once. The stunned survivors couldn't yet comprehend that it was an accident. Some thought the Germans had attacked the city by surprise, perhaps a bomb from the sky or a U-boat in the harbor. Others believed a massive factory boiler must have exploded, or a whole train of TNT blown up. The truth, that Halifax had essentially blown itself apart, slowly became clear in the hours ahead. What everyone did understand was that the city was in ruins, and its people were in desperate need. Where Mont Blanc had been, there was now nothing but a deep smoking crater, under the water, and a blasted shoreline. The Richmond railway yard was simply gone, his tracks mangled and his trains obliterated. The small telegraph building where Vincent Coleman had sent his warning was nowhere to be seen. Coleman himself, as he surely knew, had died at his post. The brave dispatcher's body would later be found amid the wreckage of the rail yard. But his selfless message had gotten through in time. On the outskirts of Halifax, the passenger train he'd warned screeched to a halt on the tracks, the conductor having received the urgent telegraph. 300 lives were saved by Coleman's final act of courage. A half-mile radius around the explosion was essentially flattened. The Richmond district, a tightly knit working-class neighborhood of wooden homes, had been wiped off the map. Rescue workers would later struggle to even find traces of the streets and addresses that had been there. Farther out, Thousands of homes had roofs ripped off and windows blown in. The entire north end of Halifax was devastated. Factories and warehouses by the pier were heaps of brick. The sugar refinery, the printing press, the entire naval dockyard, all either gone or burning. The city's main newspaper building had collapsed like a house of cards. Churches and schools crumbled. The Richmond School, where dozens of children had just settled in for the morning lesson, was obliterated, killing most inside. The magnitude of destruction was unfathomable. Yet even amid this hellish scene, humanity endured. Almost as soon as the explosion shock passed, survivors sprang into action to help one another. Those who could still walk began digging for neighbors buried in rubble. Bloodied men and women, themselves injured, formed human chains to pull debris off collapsed houses. Navy sailors from ships that survived or were docked rushed ashore to aid the stricken. One sailor commandeered a rowboat and began ferrying wounded people to the still-standing hospital across the harbor in Dartmouth. In downtown Halifax, office workers tore up their shirts for makeshift bandages and started tending to bleeding strangers on the street. Amid fires and choking dust, countless acts of heroism glimmered. There were miraculous rescues. In what remained of a little house on Campbell Road, neighbors heard the cries of a baby. A young mother clawed through the timber and plaster that had been her home, digging with her bare hands, and pulled out her infant daughter, alive and virtually unharmed. The mother's hands were torn and bleeding, but she wept with joy, cradling her child amid the ruins. In another part of Richmond, a schoolboy, no older than 13, found himself half buried by a collapsed wall. He pushed himself free, and despite a gash on his head, managed to lead 2 crying kindergartners out from the wreckage of their school. He held their hands and walked them, dazed and shivering, to a makeshift aid station in a church that still stood, reassuring them all the way. The city's hospitals, though damaged, immediately became havens for the injured. The main Halifax hospital up on Citadel Hill had taken heavy damage, windows blown out, doors ripped from hinges, but the structure stood. The halls quickly filled with the wounded. Stretchers, doors used as stretchers, and even planks of wood carried in wave after wave of casualties. Nurses and doctors, some working with bandages over their own cuts, moved room to room in dim light. The blast had knocked out power. Operating rooms and wards overflowed. At the Victoria School, which had survived the blast, staff converted classrooms into emergency hospital space. Even the YMCA and the city's churches opened their doors to treat the injured. An exhausted nurse, her white uniform stained with blood, comforted a young woman who kept calling for her missing sister. In one corner, a doctor performed an amputation on a kitchen table that volunteers had hauled in, using chloroform in sheer haste. The city's medical community, though itself a victim of the blast, worked feverishly to save whom they could. Daylight gave way to evening, and an unsettling darkness fell over Halifax, lit only by the flicker of flames. The entire city seemed to burn. Fires raged in the north and along the waterfront, consuming what little remained of some neighborhoods. The glow could be seen for miles out to sea. Firefighters from surrounding towns arrived and fought the blazes through the night, their faces illuminated orange against the blackness. By now, a cold wind was blowing in from the Atlantic, and temperatures were dropping below freezing. With so many homes destroyed, thousands of people had nowhere to go. That night, families huddled together in public parks and open fields, around bonfires fueled by bits of wreckage. Others crowded into the few church basements and community halls left intact, sharing blankets and what warmth they could. Shock was giving way to sorrow and exhaustion. In the flickering firelight, faces streaked with soot and tears stared blankly at the inferno that had been their city. But help was already on the way. The moment telegraph lines crackled with news of the disaster, neighboring communities mobilized. The town of Truro, upon hearing Halifax's plight, immediately loaded a relief train with doctors, nurses, and supplies and sent it racing down the tracks. By late that first evening, the Truro train had arrived on the outskirts of Halifax. Tracks nearer the city were too damaged to use, and volunteers unloaded food, water, and medical supplies by hand carts in the dark. All night, more survivors were found under rubble and pulled out, and the fresh medical teams from outside likely saved many who might have bled to death. Further away, in the city of Boston, news of the catastrophe struck a deep chord. Halifax had long been a friendly port to New England, and the people of Boston wasted no time responding. Massachusetts' governor and Boston's mayor organized a massive relief effort by telegraph even before the day was out. As a blizzard blew up the coast, a train loaded with everything that could be gathered: doctors and Red Cross nurses, crates of medical supplies, food, warm clothing, and even rebuilding materials, departed Boston for the 700-mile journey to Nova Scotia. Plowing through snowdrifts, the Boston relief train pressed on, determined to reach Halifax. It would arrive just a couple of days later, its passengers disembarking to find a city blanketed in fresh snow and suffering anew from the cruel winter storm. That blizzard, which blew in on the night of December 7th, was the final stroke of misery. Heavy snow and gale winds extinguished some fires, but also froze the city's water hoses, buried ruins under drifts, and killed or stranded those who had no shelter. Yet even the storm could not stop the relief. Through knee-deep snow, soldiers, sailors, and volunteers carried on searching the ruins for anyone still alive, their lanterns bobbing in the white gloom. They brought warm blankets and hot soup to shivering families in makeshift shelters. In one poignant scene, a group of Navy men found a little girl wandering alone and wrapped her in a Navy pea coat, giving her a piece of chocolate to stop her from crying. In the days and weeks that followed, Halifax worked to heal itself with the help of countless friends and strangers. Hospitals in other provinces welcomed the injured, whose care would take months. Fundraising drives around Canada and abroad collected money for the survivors. Temporary housing sprung up, rows of canvas tents and wooden huts to shelter those who had lost everything. The Canadian government sent troops to clear wreckage and engineers to assess which structures could be saved. Funeral processions became a daily reality, small and somber, as families laid to rest their dead in mass graves when individual burials proved impossible. Nearly 2,000 people had been killed and about 9,000 injured. Virtually no one in the city was untouched by grief. As the dust settled, attention turned to understanding how this had happened, and who, if anyone, was to blame. A formal judicial inquiry convened before winter's end. It was hard for Haligonians, stricken with anger and sorrow, to accept that this was a tragic accident of war. Initial finger-pointing targeted the Mont-Blanc's captain and crew. Why hadn't they warned the city more urgently? Some cried. Or why were they allowed to carry such deadly cargo into Halifax at all? Others pointed at Captain Fromm of the IMO for recklessly violating harbor navigation rules and barreling through the Narrows at too high a speed. The inquiry ultimately ruled that Mont-Blanc's crew were chiefly at fault, an unpopular decision given the crew's own tragic circumstances, and the fact that many felt
the emo's actions were equally egregious. A later review quietly declared that both vessels had contributed to the disaster. But in truth, it was a perfect storm of misjudgment, peacetime rules colliding with wartime needs, and pure bad luck. No one intended this outcome. Yet nearly an entire city neighborhood lay in ruins because of a chance encounter on a calm morning. Halifax, however, would not remain in ruins. The city's resilience was evident from the first terrible day, and it carried Halifax through the slow recovery ahead. Rebuilding started almost immediately and continued through 1918 and beyond. Neighbors rebuilt neighbors' homes. The ruined Richmond area eventually rose again, rechristened as the Hydrostone District, featuring sturdy houses made of concrete blocks, hydrostone, and a thoughtfully planned layout, a living memorial to the fact that something good would rebuild upon the ashes. City planners widened streets and implemented stricter building codes. No longer would wooden homes be built so densely by the harbor without regard to fire risk. Lessons learned from Halifax agony were studied by other cities, making harbors safer and emergency responses swifter in the future.
The cultural impact of the Halifax explosion also endured. For years, the mention of Halifax carried a weight of sorrow across Canada, much as Hiroshima would after 1945. The story of the disaster, with its unthinkable destruction and incredible acts of bravery, became part of the city's identity. Writers and artists tried to make sense of it. A famous novel, Barometer Rising, 1941, set its drama in Halifax during that week, bringing the catastrophe to life on the page for those who hadn't experienced it. Songs, poems, and later films recounted the tale, ensuring that new generations would know what happened that cold December morning. One beautiful tradition was born from the horror. In the immediate aftermath, Boston's relief efforts were among the most significant and swift. As a gesture of eternal gratitude, Halifax sent the city of Boston a grand Christmas tree the very next year, in 1918. Many decades later, Halifax revived this gesture, and to this day, every year Nova Scotia selects a magnificent fir tree to send to Boston at Christmas time. It stands on Boston Common, lit up with thousands of lights, a shining symbol of friendship, gratitude, and hope that emerged from the darkest of times. Today, more than a century later, Halifax bears scars, but also pride. On Fort Needham Hill, overlooking the spot where Mont-Blanc met its fate, a memorial carillon of bells rings out every December 6th at 9:04 a.m., sending solemn tones across a now peaceful harbor. The city stops to remember the nearly 2,000 souls lost in an instant, the thousands more scarred or made orphans or widows. They remember Vincent Coleman, the telegraph man who gave his life to save a train full of strangers. They remember the sailors, the firefighters like Billy Wells who lived and those who died, the children, the mothers, the fathers, an entire community's worth of stories. Halifax rebuilt, but it did not forget. This is the history that refuses to stay buried. The Halifax explosion remains etched in the collective memory as a warning and a testament. A warning of how a single moment of carelessness or misfortune can unleash untold devastation. A testament to how people, when faced with the abyss, can respond with courage, compassion, and unity. On that day, a city was torn apart by its own harbor, yet its people found the strength to piece it together again. Halifax, the city that blew itself apart, became Halifax, the city that rose back up, forever changed, forever resilient.